All right, everyone, welcome to the Libertarian Angle with Jacob Hornberger and Sheldon Richman. Jacob Hornberger is founder and president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, who was a practicing lawyer in Texas for 12 years and an adjunct professor of law and economics at the University of Dallas. In 1987, he left the practice of law to accept the position of program director at the Foundation for Economic Education in Irvington-Hudson, New York. He founded the Future of Freedom Foundation in 1989 and is co-editor or contributor to 7 books published by FFF, including The Failure of America's Foreign Wars and Liberty, Security, and the War on Terrorism. Sheldon Richman is the vice president of the Future of Freedom Foundation and the editor of FFF's monthly journal, Future of Freedom. He is the author of 3 books, Separating School and State, Tethered Citizens, and Your Money or Your Life. Sheldon served for 15 years as editor of the Foundation for Economic Education's monthly journal, The Freeman, and before that was employed at the Cato Institute and the Institute for Humane Studies. His articles have appeared in the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, American Scholar, Chicago Tribune, USA Today, Christian Science Monitor, Counterpunch, and other publications. Ladies and gentlemen, the Libertarian Angle.
Thank you all very much. It's great to be a part of the Students for Liberty Conference once again. This is our 3rd year in a row, and it's absolutely great to be participating with you guys in this quest for liberty. We're going to do our Libertarian Angle show that we do on the internet. We've been doing it for a year now, and we just love it. And we took it on tour to a bunch of colleges a couple of months ago in the Southeast and had a blast with it. So we thought, let's bring it to the audience here at Students for Liberty. It's an entirely spontaneous conversation. Sheldon doesn't even know how I'm going to start out, and we're just going to converse for 30 minutes about these issues and in a spontaneous way. And we think that's much more interesting sometimes than a prepared lecture. And then we'll open it up for Q&A in the last 15 minutes. Okay, Sheldon, here we have a huge conference, Libertarian Conference, and I would venture to say that most of the talks here are on economics. And I know I got into this thing because of economics. I discovered Fee early on, and I was reading Mises and Bastiat and Henry Hazlitt and Hayek. But over the years, I started to suspect that there's another dimension to this liberty fight that many libertarians are just either not aware of or they don't appreciate the gravity of the situation. And that was that on one side, we got the welfare state, the drug war, the regulated society. But over here, you got the national security state, the warfare state. And I finally come to the conclusion that this part of it, the warfare state, is a much graver threat to our freedom and well-being than the welfare state. And so that was why I felt like, hey, we need to come to a conference like this. And sure, there's other economic talks going on, but we'll record it for students that are attending other functions. But that we need to raise the vision of students and everyone to the gravity of the situation we face, a government that's got the power to assassinate us, round us up, take us to concentration camps. And that's why I think that we're here raising people's vision to the importance of civil liberties in the national security state.
And obviously, I second your idea there. It's very important that we show libertarians and then the world beyond that this is a grave threat to individual liberty, and that the threats don't only come in the form of economic regulation or drug wars or immigration restrictions, but that prosecuting wars, perpetual war, whether it's with troops being sent directly or by drone or some high-tech method or by special ops that are basically invisible to the American people, or domestic spying, or the threat to indefinitely detain American citizens and others, that this is the grave threat, and the other doesn't really matter. You can't have a free market if all that is also going on. These issues are not separable, and I believe that it's really all of a piece. I did an article a couple of weeks ago on this idea that they really do all fit together with the different parts serving each other. Now, of course, you can analyze them separately and put the spotlight on separate issues, which we're doing today on the war and the civil liberties issue, but it's also a good idea for us to explain how it fits in the bigger picture, how it serves the interventionist state, in the internal domestic interventionist state, to have this sort of robust foreign policy that we find such a threat. So I agree with the mission completely.
Yeah, I look at things that you mentioned here, the power to assassinate, the NSA surveillance schemes that were previous to the Snowden revelation secret, the power to round us up, that's the Jose Padilla case. And I look at things like this and it boggles my mind that there's actually Americans that they think they live in a free country. I mean, these are all powers that are inherent to a totalitarian regime. I don't care how much freedom of speech you have. If the government has the authority to assassinate you whenever the president wants and send out his gendarmes to assassinate you, put you on a kill list, what good's freedom of speech? I mean, everybody's life is going to be affected in that sense. If the government's got the power to put this surveillance on us, spy on us, monitor us, how can your conduct not be altered, knowing that somebody can be listening in on your telephone conversations? And I think that, and reading our emails, and I think that's one of the big problems we have in this country. And I've said this about the welfare state since our inception at the Future of Freedom Foundation. The problem is people think they're free. And you go to these sports events where, oh, thank God I'm an American because at least I know I'm free. And yet here we are living under a regime that is exercising extreme totalitarian powers. And you know, it's like Goethe's quote is one of my favorite quotes. None are more hopelessly enslaved than those who falsely believe they're free.
Right, and it's you know, it's complex. So the average person who's not paying attention to this, who's busy making a living, raising a family, being involved in their community, they don't have the time. Most people, and we can't expect it of them, to be on the internet reading you know, our site or Counterpunch or informing themselves. I mean, this relates to something I've been writing the last couple of weeks now on my TGIF column, and to borrow Brian Kaplan's book title, it's The Myth of the Rational Voter. You know, the theory is that the average person will become informed, and yet it's a false theory. It's a bad theory. It never should have been expected. There's what's known as rational ignorance, where a person will feel, even if it does come to their attention, they might say, well, I guess I'd like to spend time knowing more about what's going on, but I have all these other things I need to do. Plus, even if I become informed, what good does it do me? Oh, sure, yeah, maybe I'm more erudite because I have more information now, but what can I do about it? Casting my one vote isn't going to change anything. And people have a sense of that. So it's simply good. They're being good, in a way, good economists at their own individual level. Why invest the time and the money to learn when that's time away from my family, my kids, my church, whatever, my community, and I can't do anything about it anyway. So we have to teach them that maybe there is something in it for them. We have to bring it to their attention so that, you know, they make this sort of, quote, rational decision not to become informed because they figure there's nothing they can do with it anyway. That's a very tough thing for us to break through. I mean, that's part of what our mission is.
Break through that.
Yeah, that's a fascinating point. As like, you know, why do we even have a conference here? I mean, can we really influence change? This goes to methodology that you and I have talked about a long time. But before we get to that, and that's a fascinating subject that I think we need to delve into, is what's the point of all this? You know, can we really change the world? Can we change our country in a different direction with things like we're doing here? But before that, I think a big part of the problem is that so many people have been born and raised now under this system. And with a welfare state and a warfare state, and you're inculcated in the first grade in the public schools, government schools that most of us are attending, and you're inculcated with this notion that you live in a free country and your Pledge of Allegiance, you're saying the Pledge of Allegiance, which is a pledge crafted by a socialist, a dyed-in-the-wool socialist, and you're saying one country with justice and freedom and justice for all. And so you really are, you know, your mind is molded for 12 years into really being convinced you live in a free country. And so no one gives any thought to the idea that this whole national security state apparatus was no part of America's founding. Comes into existence in the aftermath of World War II. You get a CIA, you get an NSA, you get a big standing army, military bases all over the world, regime change operations, Cold War, communists are coming to get us. And then you've got the welfare state that comes in from the Roosevelt administration in the 30s saying, oh, well, we're here to take care of you, and people would die in the streets if you didn't have this coerced system. Well, if you're inculcated with the notion that this is all freedom, then our job, it seems to me, as a first step is to say, this is not freedom at all. This had nothing to do with the founding principles of this country, and you cannot consider yourself free when you're living under this kind of welfare warfare state system.
Yeah, of course, that's what the schools were set up to do. Certainly one of the major missions of the schools was to mold good citizens, in the in the eyes of the social engineers who were pushing for government schools in the first place. And part of that was to not question things too closely. And that comes in at the, in the beginning in the 1830s, and then by the end of that century, pretty much every state has a comprehensive government school system, and part of it was to shape the thinking of kids, get them young, and turn them into the proper kind of citizen, somebody who would be suitable for working in the factories, working in the bureaucracy, or going into the military, being the soldiers, but also having this idea of America as the social engineers saw it. I would actually put the seeds of all this, and I think it's actually more than seeds, much further back than post-World War II. I've been recently reading or rereading a very good book by Gordon S. Wood, a very eminent historian, called Empire of Liberty, which is about the time from about 1789 to 1815. And he points out that certainly for the first 10 years under the Constitution in the 1790s, the Federalists were basically an aristocracy. They saw themselves that way. They had uninterrupted rule during that time. And their view, and they wrote about things like this, their view, and you can see this in John Adams, is that Americans don't have to be concern themselves with liberty anymore. The institutions are there, the revolution is over, we're an independent nation, the Constitution's been written, the machinery of government has been set up. Now just have faith in your leaders and go about and live your lives. And you don't need to be worried. They didn't want people thinking about these things. So it reaches that far back. And I think you can then see that progress as that century goes on.
Well, yeah, and okay, I'll go back to 1898, the Spanish-American War, which sometimes we libertarians point to as the turn toward empire. Here you have the U.S., battling the Spanish Empire, and supposedly helping to liberate the Cubans and the Filipinos and others. And in the process, it's the U.S. that simply substitutes for the Spanish Empire. They control Cuba. They keep troops there. They have the Platt Amendment that says, your jurisdiction is now subject to our jurisdiction. And then you have this massive war against the Filipinos, who thought they were fighting for independence and end up fighting the U.S. troops and lose hundreds of thousands of Filipinos. We go up to World War I, which, talk about an idiotic intervention. American men dying for nothing. It was not the war to end all wars. It did not bring the world safe for democracy. It set the stage for World War II and the so-called Good War, in which they partner with the Soviet communists. They produce then, right after that, a Cold War against their former partners. And now all of a sudden we're in Korea without even a declaration of war, fighting the whole Cold War. The communists are coming to get us. They tell us they sacrificed 58,000 American men of my generation, including some of my classmates at VMI, or schoolmates. And they're telling us, oh, well, if we don't get in there, the dominoes will fall, the communists will come and take over the federal government. It was all a lie. It was all part of this racket to maintain this giant imperial army that it was coming up through the early part of the 20th century, building up, and then the aftermath of the Cold War expands into these overseas military bases, regime change operations, torture, assassination, just goes on and on.
Well, as we heard from Stephen Kinzer in the last session, of course, it begins even before the Spanish-American War with the annexation of Hawaii. But even that's starting the movie too late, because the have acquired or just discovered a paper that was published in the American History Review, I believe, some years ago, that the model for the repression of the Filipinos was the Indian Wars, self-consciously. And we have to look at the Indian Wars. What were the Indian Wars? The Indian Wars were an act of empire building that began on day one, really. I mean, certainly day one of American independence, and not that there wasn't stuff going on before that. And everybody, basically, all the leaders, including the people we tend to think were among the better ones, like Jefferson, all shared in that view. By the way, Empire of Liberty was Jefferson's phrase, which he then later changes to Empire for Liberty when the Indians aren't being cooperative. And you know what happened there. First of all, in the 1790s, you have General Wayne slaughtering Indians. Later, you have the Trail of Tears under Jackson. Beginning in the 1860s, you have Indian wars constantly pushing the Indians further west, promising that, okay, here's a line that we won't cross. You stay on that side, we'll stay on that side, on this side. And of course, the white men never kept their word. And that was empire building. That was building an empire. That was manifest destiny. We were destined to dominate and control North America. I mean, if things had worked out a little differently, Canada would have been part of the United States. You know about Mexico. We can look at the what do they call it, the late unpleasantness, 1861 to 1865, as not empire building, but empire preservation. It was cracking apart. We couldn't have that happen. Lincoln and the others couldn't have it happen. I think there's this theme that runs all the way through, beginning on day one. And so we have our work cut out for us. This is not just something that started on 9/11 or 1947 or even 1898. It's something, and Kinzer mentioned it, it's something in sort of the American psyche. There's a good and a bad side to it. America was different. Yeah, in some ways it certainly was. The expressions in the Declaration of Independence and the average person, yes, had this consciousness of wanting to be free that maybe we didn't find other places. So there is a distinctiveness there. You can call that an exceptional, but then that can immediately turn dark, can't it? Well, we're different. We can bring light to the rest of the world. And that way lies trouble. If we're interested in freedom and justice and peace, that's dangerous.
Yeah, I think there's been this conflict of visions since the inception of the country. A conflict between those that want to initiate force and exercise power and move into imperialism, and later the progressive movement that wanted welfarism and so forth. And then there's this libertarian strand that's in the judiciary. I've written about it, and that there was a libertarian strand within the federal judiciary that was preserving fundamental rights, the rights of liberty, life, property, in John Locke's treatise on government and the Declaration of Independence. But let's move up to 9/11. You brought that up, and you know the argument is, oh well, the terrorists attacked us. This is war. We don't have a choice now. And you and I both recall those were dark days for us. I mean, we were standing fast, and within 30 days of that 9/11 attack, I wrote an op-ed saying, is it too soon to reevaluate U.S. foreign policy? And the hate mail, I've never seen so much hate mail flooding in during those periods of time, donation cancellations, and yet you, before 9/11, had written some op-eds saying if the U.S. government doesn't stop doing what it's doing in the Middle East, we're going to see terrorism on American soil. And this happened after the end of the Cold War, which the national security apparatus never thought would happen. They thought they could keep scaring Americans with communism forever. And that shocked them. And so all they did was just go in the Middle East and start provoking hornets' nests. You were pointing this out. I was pointing this out. And you had the 93 attack on the World Trade Center. You had the attack on the USS Cole. You had the attack on the U.S. embassies in East Africa. And so it wasn't a big shocker for us when 9/11 comes along. It was just a continuum. But they used 9/11 to scare the heck out of the American people, maybe more fearful than communism. Terrorists are coming to get us. And man, the whole ugly, brutal nature of what had preceded that throughout the Cold War came into fruition. Torture, which had kind of been kept under the table at Vietnam War and so forth. I mean, assassinations, which of course the CIA had been engaged in the 50s and 60s. It all came in all its ugliness. And they all said it was necessary, and it wasn't necessary at all.
Right, I remember on that day, I put out an email to a little email list that I had. It was nothing formal, and I didn't look over the names closely. You know, that can be dangerous, right? And I said something like, there's the Blowback, and I got a few people telling me, please take my name off your list, and somebody even wondered if I was crazy. Of course, I don't want to take any credit for what I wrote in 1999 saying something could happen, because like you said, 6 years earlier, there already was an attempt on the World Trade Center, so I was hardly being much of a prophet, and other people had written such things, had warned about such things before. So I just happened to say it not that long before 2001. Doesn't show any great talent on my part for predicting the future. But it seemed to me any thinking person who was really paying attention to American foreign policy, especially in the Middle East, particularly in the Middle East, should have been worried about that. Certainly there was a lot of violence going on over there. There had been violence in Europe, right? There had been cases where Palestinians had set off explosives in airports in Germany, perhaps France. I don't remember all the details now, but there were things going on. Folks will remember in the 70s, after the '67 war in the Middle East. So it didn't take a lot to see that something could happen, and that there was no reason to think the United States was invulnerable to something like that. First of all, despite all the real things you mentioned, it certainly was then a generally open society, which means if you really were intent on hurting a lot of people, you could find a way to do it. I mean, it's just the nature of a very large open society that doesn't have checkpoints everywhere, thank goodness. And so that does mean the potential is always there. So that may be why you and I were both wondering about this in the late 90s.
Well, and we saw the anger. I mean, the Iraq sanctions that we were both arguing against, that were killing Iraqi children, by the hundreds of thousands. This was a moral outrage. 2 high UN officials. This is before 9/11. So you're killing children on a daily basis. And 2 high UN officials resigned their posts in protest. They said, we cannot participate in this genocide. And when Americans tried to help people with taking medicines over there, they prosecuted them, fined them, and it was all, oh, well, we got to get rid of Saddam. Saddam was the big fear factor at that time, they scared Americans with. And WMDs and all that nonsense. And then there was the no-fly zones over Iraq where they were killing teenagers and stuff with missiles. They had support of brutal dictators, and let's face it, Saddam was one of the dictators they supported. They had the regime change operation in Iran in '53, and then they're shocked, in '79, like, oh my gosh, why are they so angry at us? We installed a brutal dictator that brutalized the Iranian people. And so you've got the unconditional support for the Israeli government during all this time. I mean, how could it have been anything but a surprise? But they turn it around, and that's when they bring up that thing about, freedom and values, that's how they attacked us. And when we say, this is logically following from what you have done over there, people, you hate America, and you hate all this, this nonsense business that we got hit with. But now, I think people are figuring out what's going on in this thing, that the national security state apparatus really is at the root of it. And one more thing, they used that attack, 9/11, to take away our freedom with the NSA spying and the torture and the power to round up Americans, put us in concentration camps. If we get rid of the empire, Sheldon, we get rid of the interventionism, then we don't need all this other junk. We dismantle this thing. We don't need the NSA spying. We don't need the NSA. We don't need the CIA. We don't need this vast military empire.
Well, it's like that old line that, they attacked us for our freedom, and we're going to make sure they don't have grounds to do that again. Seems like a very efficient strategy. Well, I hope people are catching on to it. I'm not as confident as you are that they are. This is not exactly a random sample of people. So don't let your optimism run away with you. It's good to be an optimist, but keep it realistic. When we started and other people started saying 9/11, history didn't begin on 9/11, that wasn't a bolt out of the blue. People didn't believe that because they never heard the other stuff before. They didn't know about 1953. They might have known about 1979, although I doubt that their memories even went back that far. They probably said, yeah, there was something about hostages, didn't they? Under Carter, they took hostages. But they didn't know why. They didn't understand 53. So, of course, it's going to sound outlandish to them. They've just gone through the public school mill, right? There's a terrible attack, knocking down 2 big buildings and, crashing into the Pentagon, and another attempt to fly a plane into something. And people naturally get angry at that. And then you say, well, wait a second, you got to calm down and understand this. Look at the history of American foreign policy and see how this was not unprovoked. Doesn't mean that what they did was correct, but at least try to understand it. most people are not going to say, oh yeah, please tell me about that. I never knew any of that. Most people don't like their worldview upset. And they certainly don't go out of their way to upset it. Most people look for, it's known as confirmation bias, right? You look for stuff that confirms your long-held views, most of which were absorbed, not through careful examination and thought, but just from their upbringing and then their friends and then the media, the schools. And so this feels natural, it fits them like a comfortable old coat, and they're not really looking around to take off the coat and put on a new coat. We're asking a lot of people. It doesn't mean we shouldn't ask it, but we should really know that we are asking a lot of people, and that's why our job's tough.
Well, right, and they use the 9/11 attacks as the excuse to invade Iraq, which they'd wanted to do the whole time with the sanctions to get rid of Saddam. They use as the excuse, and WMDs are going to be there and all that nonsense, and then Afghanistan. And then they create this perpetual terrorist-producing machine. I call it the greatest terrorist-producing machine in history. The more wedding parties they bombed, the more so-called collateral damage where they were killing people, they produced 10 terrorists for every person they killed. So it's a perfect machine, greater budgets, greater spending, more fear and so forth. And so the result is where we are today. And in the 5 minutes we got left here, let's go back to methodology though. I mean, what's the point of having a conference like this? I mean, is it really futile? And you and I have always argued the power of ideas, that ideas can change the course of a nation. And one person can make a difference. There's a reason why totalitarian dictators shut meetings like this down. Because they know the power that goes on in a meeting like this, the synergy that takes place between people, the social hours, the interaction, and that dynamic can force government in a brand new direction. And we just reach a critical mass. And so I say that we keep building on this movement. And it's an exciting movement, this libertarian movement. It's a consistent movement. It's a principled movement. We keep building, and I think the country will shift.
Well, yeah, I think ideas can be powerful, and that's why we have to work through them. I'm very glad that we're pretty certain no one's going to come bursting through this room and break up the meeting. On the other hand, just to be somewhat realistic about it, and again, I'm not hoping that it happens, but that would drive home more of a point to the American people. In other words, there is a notion called repressive tolerance. Thomas Saz used to say, you can control a bar of soap much easier, a wet bar of soap much easier with a gentle grip than a firm grip. Isn't that true? I mean, you all know this, right? What happens if you grab? So by letting us have meetings, and I'm not saying they've thought all this stuff out, but who knows, maybe some of them have. By letting meetings go on, they actually are more secure. Because the moment they start breaking up meetings and it starts to remind people of what they've heard about in totalitarian countries, then maybe ideas start changing even quicker in our direction. Now that doesn't mean I'm hoping they start breaking up meetings, but I think there is some logic there that we have to keep in mind. But getting back to your main point, yes, it's ideas that we have to work through. Why do we do this? Obviously, I would say, I don't know what the percentage would be, but I'm sure most people here came here because they believe in liberty or are interested in liberty. They may have different levels of knowledge, so they're here for different reasons. Either they want to really begin the learning process, or they're already far along and they want to meet people. All those reasons. There may be a few people here who got attracted and said, I want to know what this stuff's all about. I've heard about libertarianism. I don't really know much about it. I'm just a regular, Democrat or something, or Republican or middle of the road. So maybe they come to learn about that. I hope there are some of those. But whoever they are, it seems to me it's for the sake of liberty that we speak in front of them and distribute literature and converse and just get them going. They'll go home excited, which is good, and they'll maybe organize local groups or just be better at talking to friends, writing letters to the editor or op-eds to the local paper. You don't know what comes out of it. It's like the Johnny Appleseed model, right? You go through the country throwing the apple seeds, and you're never sure which ones are going to turn into great apple trees. But right. What else can we do? I'm also an Aristotelian. Virtue in part is its own reward. So promoting liberty is good, even if we don't achieve it. Someday people will achieve it, but even if it doesn't happen while we're still around, there's still a virtue in promoting it.
Yeah, there's a joy in it. This is fun, and we should never forget that this is a glorious battle that we're in. And it's fun to be part of it, and you can tell by looking at this conference that the coolest people now are libertarians, And we get inspired too, and we learn from people here at these conferences. We get our batteries charged up. So on that note, let's open it up for some discussion. Would y'all go up to the microphone, though? It's not a broadcaster, but it does record for the videotape.
We will try to remember to repeat the question to make sure it's heard by others.
Okay, my name is Jacob Roth. I'm from Northwestern University, just a sophomore undergraduate. What I'm curious about is, it's all well and good to have the more intellectual debate about the nature of the security state, but when you mention to most Americans the expansiveness of U.S. foreign policy and our presence abroad, their response will often be, well, we need this to protect ourselves. There are people out there who want to kill us. U.S. hegemony provides a backbone and a structure to the world. How do you make an argument just to the layperson that hegemony isn't necessarily what's keeping order and peace in the world?
Well, I would say, yeah, oh, yeah, see, I forgot it right away. That's the easiest thing to forget. So the question is, how do you explain to just a lay person who hasn't studied the sort of things we've all studied here, that U.S. hegemony is not necessary to keep order in the world and ultimately to assure our own security? Because a lot of people think that. Again, they've absorbed that from what they hear on the media and so-called experts. So how do we answer that? I guess I'd say a couple things. First, it's very important to look at policies from the other side, right, from the receiving end. So even if we totally intend it as assuring, bringing order to the world and protecting us, other people don't see it that way, and it's not really unreasonable that they don't. I mean, look what the U.S. has done. It's overthrown regimes. It's put in dictators. It's aided those dictators in reigns of terror. That doesn't. It's hard to convince the people in those countries we've done this all for your own good. In the 90s, when the U.S. went to war against Iraq in '91, where it deliberately destroyed sanitation systems and water facilities and sewage facilities, leading to the deaths of those kids, and then through sanctions didn't let them replace those things, how do you convince them it's for your own good? Because you got a bad dictator there. We're nice people, so you should like what we do. So I think that's one approach. You got to be calm and friendly, and not alienate them in your manner, which is something I still need to learn about at my advanced age. But we have to patiently try to explain that.
Now, I think your point is I think that's the big challenge, because everybody's born and raised under this system, and they think it's the key to their safety. I want safety. I want security. If you dismantle all these military bases overseas and bring the troops home, there's going to be chaos in the world. And everybody's going to come and get us and so forth. That's the challenge we face. And we don't have the perfect answer to that, but you have posed the big question. How do you convince people that you're actually safer and more secure in a free society where you don't have a big standing army, you don't need a CIA, Cold War's over, you don't need an NSA, and that you're actually freer and safer? There's no country on earth, no nation state that's got the remotest military potential, even the money, to even contemplate crossing either ocean to invade or attack the United States. And now that we're getting out of Iraq and Afghanistan, we've got to convince people that this pivot toward Asia, they're going to just provoke new crises with China, Korea, and that it's time, and Africa, the same thing, time to bring everybody home and then decide what to do with them here. So that'd be a first step, dismantle the empire.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's David Lowenthal. I'm a recent graduate from Boise State. One thing that kind of really annoys me, and I find it everywhere, and I'm sure you have, and I'm sure everyone in this room has, is people kind of like bifurcate the state almost, whereas conservatives tend to hate everything the domestic government does on the, quote, homeland, but everything that is done on the foreign policy front is wonderful and awesome, but they think the minimum wage is, which is bad and has its problems, is tantamount to waterboarding, and waterboarding is tantamount to nothing bad at all. And progressives tend to think that everything that the government does domestically, at least on the regulatory welfare state side, is wonderful, but foreign policy is just all wrong. So how do you have any theories or hypotheses about this kind of bifurcation and why people just can't seem to make that leap to the what government does almost all the time is terrible?
Okay, he's asking about why. Isn't it fascinating that there's this bifurcation that goes on in the minds of progressives, liberals, and conservatives. Conservatives love big government, if I can summarize it that way, and foreign policy, the drug war, so forth. And progressives are a little bit better in that area. They want to restrain government, drug war, and so forth. But progressives love the big government over here. I don't know. I mean, to me, that's when I grew up as a liberal leftist. You know, I was in the Democratic Party, and I was, welfare state, loved it and everything. And when I discovered libertarianism, everything just came consistent for me. That this is the way to help the poor is through a free society, and it boggles my mind that the progressives can see the assassinations and the roundups and see this government, but then say we can trust them to handle our health care. I mean, it just boggles the mind, and it's the same with conservatives. They want free markets and limited government, but man, all of a sudden they favor this giant leviathan and giant drug war and putting people in jail forever. And I don't know. We've talked about it, Sheldon and I, and we've said, we don't know if libertarianism is in people's DNA, or whether you can really, find people that'll change their perspective. We don't know, but we figure it's like what he says: just keep throwing out the seeds, like Johnny Appleseed does, and let's see what happens.
Yeah, I think it's essentially one church, just like it's one party, it's one political ideology, but there's some differences in emphases. And I like to point out how it really is a unified system. I think the welfare state is there to assure against civil unrest that itself would be the result of a system of privilege, corporatism, that cuts people out, that excludes people. I mean, think of licensing, which keeps people out of professions unless you have the money to do the prescribed schooling and pass the tests, which are given by the people already practicing whatever the occupation is. You do enough of that, you end up with an excluded class of people. It's not impossible to overcome those barriers, but it's difficult, more costly. Well, you don't want those people being, roaming the countryside, loitering, vagrancy. All this stuff goes back to Queen Elizabeth the First, where they start put in poor laws and things like poor laws to control as well as feed them. They don't want people starving in the streets, but they also don't want them getting upset and concocting revolutions. So it all fits together. The foreign policy also fits. You need overseas markets. You need to protect access to resources. It's all one integrated thing. It's dialectical. I like Chris Scabara's whole approach. I'm a dialectical libertarian. These pieces all fit together nicely. Not that there's not some spontaneity in the evolution of it. I'm not saying there's some mastermind somewhere who's minutely arranged all this. That's beyond really, I think, human powers. But there's still something like that. So that's how I approach it. Anyway.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I'm Nathan Goodman, student at the University of Utah, and I also write at the Center for a Stateless Society. One connection that gets into some of these dialectics is the connection you made it, Jacob, actually in one of your recent columns between immigration and travel restrictions and the empire. We saw a massive expansion under the auspices of the Department of Homeland Security of the entire immigration enforcement state. Restrictions on travel to Cuba were created as part of the Cold War, and now there's stuff with like Hovind Corker in the debate over immigration reform that involves massive subsidies to military contractors to build up along the borders that were drawn largely through conquest in some of the older Indian wars and Mexican-American War and such that you mentioned. So how do we make that connection, and is there a way to forge sort of alliances between the immigrants' rights movement at home and an anti-imperialist or anti-war movement against the national security state around here? Do you have any thoughts around that?
Yeah, the question is relating to this morphing of the militarization of the border with the national security state, and it is ominous. I grew up on the Texas-Mexican border. I grew up in Laredo. I grew up around the DEA and the customs and the local law enforcement people and immigration, border patrol, and it's a militarized zone on the border. I mean, everywhere you go, to every donut shop, McDonald's or whatever, you're going to see an immigration official drinking coffee or something, or open up people's trunks or something. It's horrible, and they actually have immigration control stations on the interstate highways running east-west, so that even if you don't even ever enter into Mexico, you're just traveling east-west, you're going to hit an immigration control station where they say, let us see your papers. And the people that get stopped mostly are the darker-skinned Americans. And they got one outside Laredo, about 40 miles north. So every Laredoan, doesn't even go into Mexico, gets stopped there. And it's all part of this immigration central planning mindset. I mean, that's one of the things that drew me in as a libertarian, the concept of open borders, freedom of travel. But your point is very good, because that existed independently of all this war on terrorism business, but now they're integrating it. And they've got, the drones that are talking now, watching for illegal aliens and drug dealers and terrorists, and I'm waiting for them to bring the communist scare back when they stir up another one over there in Asia. But the border area is ominous. It's a militarized zone, and I wouldn't have any surprise at all if they were to start sending troops down there to start militarizing the border, which they did many years ago, and they shot a kid who was tending his animals, and they thought he was a terrorist or something like that. So yeah.
As to your question about coalitions, I'd like to think there's a way to do that. That sounds like there's an awful lot of potential between the anti-empire people, anti-war, and the immigrant rights. I'm involved in a group in my state. I live in Arkansas with the Arkansas Coalition for Peace and Justice, which is working with immigrant organizations. I don't have a way, I can't tell you how to do it, how best to do it. I mean, I just don't know. But it seems to me, bless anybody who's working on this, because it's very important, and it seems to me there's great potential. You just got to figure out a way to do it, make the outreach.
Hello, I'm Evan Krzelka. I'm a student at Northwood University. I'm major in economics, and I'm an intern at the Macknell Center for Public Policy. I personally don't have a problem with America having, the biggest, baddest military in the world. I like the idea that we can overcome any enemy that might wish us harm. And I'm not even necessarily opposed to having a military installation here or there in a foreign country if that host nation is agreeable with that, and if it serves a necessary strategic purpose. But you can't tell me that every military base we have around the world, the hundreds that we have, are absolutely necessary, and you can't tell me that everything we're doing, all the wars we're fighting, are necessary either. If you were the commander-in-chief, what would the size and scope of the military be in your administration? How would you employ the military? And given that we have hundreds of military...
Next question.
Given that we have hundreds of military installations around the world, is it really feasible that we would actually be able to start shutting some of those down or downsizing our military? How might we be able to go about doing that? Especially since in some of these places where these military installations are, you're also going to get a fight from the locals who it serves an economic benefit for them. So how might we go about trying to get that kind of thing done?
I'll defer to the president of the Future Freedom Foundation.
Okay, he starts out by saying that he favors a large military that's able to protect us in the event of an emergency or something, and that maybe some foreign bases are okay, but he opposes most of the wars that are going on as unnecessary, and most of the bases overseas, and that what would be the ideal size of a military force here. And the reason we're laughing between each other is that Sheldon and I went on this college civil liberty college tour where we were doing this, and we would spend hours in the car, and we shared different perspectives on some of the issues you've raised. We've argued for hours over them. So I'll answer my way, and then I'll defer to Sheldon. But I would say go back and read what the Founding Fathers said about standing armies and why they were so opposed to standing armies. We've got some good articles on our website. They had a deep antipathy to standing armies, and of course read Eisenhower's farewell address about the great threat that the military-industrial complex poses to a democratic process. Read Truman's op-ed in the Washington Post 30 days after the Kennedy assassination, talking about how the CIA had become a sinister force in American life. To get to your question, I favor a very minimal defense force, very small. Now, I don't know what that quantity would be, maybe in the 10,000, 20,000 range, just as an alert. that if there ever is a nation state that's crossed in the ocean in armada of ships, that they can alert the citizens to say, rally forth, we're about to face a grave danger here, which there would be plenty of warning on because we got two oceans on our side. But also study the Swiss system. The Swiss system is really modeled on the American system, or vice versa. Everything's oriented toward national defense there. Nobody jacks with the Swiss. They're fierce fighters. That's why Hitler didn't invade, because it was like swallowing a porcupine. And I think that's sort of, now they have conscription there, which I would not favor, but this idea of citizen soldiers, which is the concept that I learned at Virginia Military Institute, where citizens can be expected to rally forth in the event of an emergency, but no big standing military force. That's my preference.
Isn't it in Switzerland all these citizens are issued a weapon and ammunition that they keep
in their homes? Everybody's got an assault rifle in their homes, and they keep them even after they're discharged. Everybody knows how to shoot. Everybody's armed. The women too. They have shooting competitions. And I'll wrap up. I give Sheldon, but there's a famous story where they asked back in the late 1800s something. A German comes over to a Swiss guy and says, "What would you do if my million-man army invaded your country with you only having 100,000 people on your forces?" And he said, "Oh, no problem. Everybody would just come up, take aim, fire 10 shots, and go home."
They've been waving the stop sign, so I really have zero time. So I would say, I think defense, like everything else, is too important to be left to the state. You would never want to trust anybody in power. Anytime you propose a policy, assume the worst people will be carrying it out. That's a good rule of thumb. Second of all, I favor Gene Sharp type civilian-based, non-violent, non-cooperation with invaders.
Thank you all very much. Appreciate it.